All right, good evening, gentlemen. So, our study of church history, we continue on our endeavor here, and we have transitioned the last several weeks into the Middle Ages. So we've come through the patristic period, we've now been in the Middle Ages, which is essentially from 500 to 1500 is specifically kind of the range that we're talking about. And in that, we have seen several things, but the kind of big moment things to remember are division that's happening in the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember that the West is kind of disintegrated in 476, and we see that there is no more emperor in the West, and that the Bishop of Rome, or the position that will eventually be called the Pope. So the Pope is the one who ends up assuming the power of the emperor, and we've seen with that power comes mass corruption. We have looked at the Great Schism of 1054. Remember, that's a bullet point there. That's a year to remember. Kind of like the patristic period, that first 500 years. Our year to remember, our date to remember is 325. Remember, which is the Council of Nicaea and Constantine there. So in the Middle Ages, it's right about the middle part is 1054, and that kind of divides the early Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages. And that, for the reason for that is, remember, the Great Schism, and that essentially is the dividing point of the East and West. Remember that the West, the Pope, the Pope in the Church of Rome there comes to the East and sends delegation to the East to say, hey, look, I'm the Pope, I'm the man, I'm the head in the West, I'm really the head over all the churches, you guys need to submit and in reverence to me, and all the churches in the East being mainly Antioch, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, many other big churches in the East. They said, no, we don't recognize you as the head of the churches here. And so essentially the West excommunicates the church in the East excommunicates the church in the West, and they say, well, you're kicked out of our church. And they say, well, you're kicked out of our church. And so now, boom, we got two different churches, and now we end up with Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East. And we've talked about several of their differences, but remember, a lot of similarities, because for about 1100 years, so over a millennium, right, 1,000 years, they are together and have the same traditions. And we've talked about that with the iconoclasts and the iconodules and worshiping of idols and having the statues and the stained glass pictures and the elevation of Mary and the elevation of the saints and praying to them. And remember, a lot of these things is what's infiltrated the church. And remember, there's still a true remnant of a church, but the church in Rome becomes so infiltrated with all these pagan practices that's where Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy start to come from. And we're going to start talking about in the future about sacraments and the selling of indulgences, just all kinds of things that are going to happen in the church. Another one of those being, again, Mary and the saints and the icons. Another one would be, remember, we haven't talked much, but we have a little bit about the darkness of those dark ages. And the Pope, we've seen that with the battles and the struggle of the papacy and wanting that power, and popes killing other popes and on through that. But also we see the darkness that the gospel is essentially hidden for that time period, because it is hidden in the Latin Bible. And if you remember, Jerome, back in the 4th and 5th century, right around 400 AD, right around there, maybe 402, I think, if I recall correctly, Jerome completes his translation, which we call the Vulgate. It's called the Latin Vulgate. And he writes the Bible and translates it into Latin because, remember, before the split and before the fall of Rome, the Western Empire spoke Latin, and the Eastern Empire spoke what? Greek. Right, good. So in the West, he translated the Bible into Latin because he wanted the common people, and that's what Vulgate means, is commoner, okay? It means common. He wanted the people to have a Bible in their language. So it was a great thing that he did. The irony is that when we get to 476 and the fall of the West, remember why that happened. It just disseminated because all these European, the Anglos and the Sacs and the Huns and the Franks and all the people we talked about, they come and Europe starts forming and all these things in the West, so the West no longer speaks Latin. You with me? So now the irony is the Vulgate is used to give the Bible, it begins as giving the Bible into the common language of the people. Now the language of the people have changed, and the Church of Rome says that only the Vulgate is the only Bible that we're going to use. And eventually it's going to get to the point where they say if anyone is found with any version of the Bible other than the Latin Vulgate, they will be executed. Okay? So no other Bibles are allowed. No one speaks Latin except for the Pope and the priests and the clergy of the church. So you see what happens with the power shift. Now they have the power because they have the Bibles, and they're the ones that teach what to say, what to think, what to do, and that's where religion comes from, and that's where Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy, that's where all that stuff goes to. So just remember, that's a big bullet point moving forward as we're going to get into more and more and more. We start to see why there's such a great need for the Reformation coming up, okay? Because at the split, again, we're in 1054. Last week, we began speaking about the Crusades, which is about a 200-year period of 7 Crusades. And we're talking about from 1095 to like 1291, I think, if you look back in your notes. So for a span of about 200 years, you have 7 of these Crusades. Remember, the Crusades are a holy war. Really, the idea kind of came from Muhammad, who led the Muslims, and now they've been taking over, remember, the eastern side and all into the areas that the Muslims have been expanding all over the place by force. And so now, under the papal authority, they are given to, I'm actually going to go ahead and go to the next slide, because these Crusades, they stick up for it by saying that it's a just war. And we talked about that at the end of our last session last week. That it's justified in their mind because they're trying to reclaim the land that the Muslims took from them, namely Jerusalem, right? And so they're trying to defend the faith. They're defending Christianity. In their mind, they're defending Christianity against Islam. They are wanting to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims who took it from them. It's justified in their mind, okay? So, also to remember, the Pope himself is the one who commissioned these Crusades and said, let's go do this thing, and let's go take back our Jerusalem, and let's go take back the land that they've been taking from us. And in fact, he went so far as to say that anyone who dies in the Crusades will immediately go to heaven. So you get a pass-go, do not stop through purgatory free card is kind of what he's selling here. So remember that, and that'll come into play obviously later, but their thoughts of purgatory, and that's when we'll get into, indulgences and all those things.
Funny, the Muslims do the same thing, but it's not, they get virgins.
That's right. That's right. That's right. The promise of something to make them do something exactly that they want them to do. Okay. So at this time frame, also, I just wanted to bring up because it's an interesting point that we're going to start seeing kings and emperors and all these European countries arise. Okay, and so we see the formation of some groups of kind of Christian warriors, these monks, and probably most of you have heard of Knights Templar. Some maybe have heard of the Hospitallers, which are known also as the Knights of St. John. But these are groups, the Knights Templar. Man, if you watch like some of those shows, actually Jill and I watched that, what's that show she likes? They've got like the couple brothers that are like searching for lost treasures and stuff like that, and the Knights Templar are known for that because they become very wealthy through the time of the Crusades, and it's believed that many of their fortunes and their things are buried in certain places, and they got lost in shipwrecks, and so.
I saw that movie.
Yeah.
The Knights Templar got some treasure.
Yeah.
Yes.
They found it. Yeah. I thought they found it.
That's right. Yeah, Nicolas Cage.
Oh, that wasn't real.
He got it all. Nicolas Cage, he got it all. But it is real. You watch, what's the name of that show, man? I'm totally drawing a blank. But anyway, there's
Show or movie?
No, there's a show on right now. And it's like these two brothers and a whole team. They're, we'll talk about it later. I'm totally drawing a blank here. But they are essentially treasure hunters. And they're on this island, and they're trying to find all these things. Crusades are peppered in there. And so the Knights Templar, though, were essentially formed, and so were the Hospitallers, formed to protect people who were going from Jerusalem to the Holy Land and going back and forth, and they were kind of out to protect them. So they become these warriors and kind of fighting for, like the theme of the Crusades was that they're fighting for the cross. They're fighting for Christ and for Christians and sticking up for them. Okay, but they do become very wealthy through these Crusades and a lot of these things. So the church at the time, regarded and understood this to be just war and a just cause. So it is a big smear, as we talked about, on the face of the Church of Rome and the Church of the East, because it's not a good time. I mean, there's going to be a lot of things going on. We're going to talk about a few of them starting tonight. Okay, we won't talk about all 7, but I've got at least the first 4 we're going to talk about a little bit, and just some of the main bullet points that are interesting and intriguing. So the First Crusade starts 1095, and you'll see these last just a couple years. It's a war essentially. So 1095 to 1099. Muslim forces are now impeding and moving into the area of Constantinople. Remember, Constantinople is in the east, right? Rome's in the west. And remember, it used to be Rome was the capital of the west, Constantinople, capital of the east. So they move in towards Constantinople. Also, you will find that it's called Byzantium. And in fact, if you go and you do your own kind of research and look at the east and the west empires of Rome, you will a lot of times see the Western Empire and the Byzantium Empire, okay? And that's what they're talking about is the Eastern Empire, because Constantinople is also going to end up being called Byzantium. And then after the Muslims take it, it's going to be called Istanbul, which is what it's called today, obviously still. Okay, so
is Byzantium different language or something? Same word?
I don't know. I don't recall that part. I don't recall. That's just that whole.
They have a temple, or a cathedral, Byzantine temple, right next to the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. And
Right.
It's so interesting because they're huge and they're right next to each other.
Sure, and there's a lot of stuff to that, because there was a church there, and we'll talk about it in the later Crusades and things. When they come and they finally do win and take over Constantinople, they remodel and turn the church into mosques, and that's what happens. So yeah, you'll see that as well. You can go into some of those mosques and see the church buildings and stuff in there. So good point. Okay, Emperor Alexius, again, notes, yes, are good, but are we going to remember all these names? No, it's a survey course. We're not having a test. Well, maybe we will. Let's have an exam at the end and have fun. But out of desperation, look, the emperor, so we're talking about an emperor, so we're talking about in the east, and he calls for help from the west. Now, that's a big deal, because why? The schism's already happened. About 40 years prior to this was the big split, and the we hate you, you hate us thing. But just like we always see, when there's a common enemy and a common goal, enemies will come together, right? We see that obviously through the Gospels with Jesus and Pharisees and Sadducees coming together, and Herodians and all them, that they hate each other coming together because they hate something else worse. So he goes and he asks for help from the Pope over in the west, and Pope Urban II at that time calls a council of Clermont. Like we talked about, there's many, many, many other councils than just those 7 ecumenical councils we talked about. But this is one that he calls for, just to essentially say, we are going to fight with the East, and our intent is to go and to get Jerusalem back. So the West is ready to go. The Pope is ready to go take Jerusalem back and join forces with the East in order to go conquer the Muslims and get their land back. Okay, so that's how the First Crusade starts. And it's pretty successful. Okay, they recapture Nicaea, which obviously we know about and heard. So it was taken, and they recapture Nicaea and Antioch as well. So major wins there for them. And then, of course, none bigger than in 1099, when they end this war, they recapture Jerusalem and they get it back from the Muslims, which we're going to see this tug-and-war back and forth. We've already seen that a couple times, right? A few times. That, in the early 130s, that's when it was conquered and taken over, and then all of a sudden they're gonna get it back, but they're gonna lose it again. So it's just gonna continue to happen. But in 1099, they do get Jerusalem back for a little bit of time. So it'll be maybe about another 100 years, 90 years from now, they're going to lose it again. But this victory leads them to believe that God is in this thing with them, right? That, hey, these holy wars are right on. We went and we did great and we won. And remember, we saw that thought process before with emperors and thinking, well, let's stop worshiping the idols, remember, so that God will have favor on us. And so that always tends to be the way. We can even micromanage that down into our own lives and be like, well, God showed me favor, so I must be doing good.
It's funny because I'm studying some Islam right now.
Yeah.
And they had the same
thought.
justification.
It's in the second one.
When they won, oh, God blesses us, it must be good.
And on that note, here you go. Second Crusade, that's exactly what's going to happen. Second Crusade is just a few years later, 1147, 1149. And the Muslims fight back now, and they get more land back. And the Christians are still going at it. They're still going to fight for their cause, but it doesn't go as well. And they lost a lot of lives. They lost a lot of land. And essentially for the Crusaders, for the so-called Christians, the church that in the West and the Pope and all them that are involved in it, they lose a lot, and it really doesn't do anything. And as alluded to by Glenn, now the Muslims view that God is on their side, and God judged the Christians on them. And so, now you've got this holy war going back and forth. And like I told you, look, this is applicable today because the Muslims still view the hostility with the United States and Israel and all the people that they're against, which are mainly Israel and us. They still view this as holy wars. They still view this as crusades, like it's still happening in their mind.
It never was a holy war, though, which is the reality. It was the Romans trying to get back the territory that they owned before. It was not
right.
Really, it was no holy in it.
Sure, but at least in that regard, yes and no, because at least the Pope, and the Church of Rome and the believers wanted Jerusalem back, understandably, because it's an important part to their religious heritage. So yeah, of course they want their land back, but they really wanted that land back. That's essentially what the main goal of theirs was, to recapture Jerusalem. This second crusade is a response from the Muslims coming back at them. So they got Jerusalem back, and it would have been over. You know what I mean? This is ours. This was ours. Rightfully, you took it. We want it back. They got it. But now the Muslims come at them, and so they feel they have to defend themselves again. So, yeah. So I think there's some validity, certainly, to what you're saying, Pete, too. Because they don't want to lose more and more of their land. And we're going to see that in the East, too. They're going to keep pushing back, keep fighting to not lose more land to the Muslims, which they continue to do. Okay. Good. Yeah, so first one's a win, and now, yay, God's on our side. Second one's a loss, and the Muslims are like, yay, now God's on our side. And of course, the Muslims think we worship the same God, but that's not the case. So Third Crusade. Got the dates there, 1189 to 1192. Again, each one of these is just a few years. The Muslims continued their expansion. Okay, they had this new guy, Saladin, who is the ruler at the time. Not Aladdin, but Saladin. And he is ruthless and hostile. And now this Third Crusade is a response to, here we go again. Saladin went in and conquered and reclaimed Jerusalem for the Muslims. And so now the Third Crusade is the Christians, again, all over saying, we want to go get Jerusalem back again. So, we've just got this back and forth battle over a specific land, which both sides find valuable to them. And obviously that's still happening today, with the Muslims, and it's the Dome of the Rock, which is what their third most holy place. But, for the Jews, their most holy place is the Temple of the Mount and all this stuff there. So they both have this claim and this stake in their own view that is right by them, and they deserve to have the thing, or they deserve to have the thing. And so you can see this has been going on for a long time, okay? So some of these names I figure I'd mention because you might recognize some of them. Richard the Lionheart of England, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip Augustus of France come to fight against the Muslims. So now we've got those European nations that are starting, right, in the West. They're now joining in with the emperor, with the Christians, in their forces and coming and getting involved. Richard the Lionheart, probably heard that name for Robin Hood, if you watch Robin Hood movies and read things like that. Richard the Lionheart was a real person. We don't know that Robin Hood was. Sorry to burst your bubble there. It's a cool movie and all, but Richard the Lionheart was, was a real king there. And Frederick, actually on the way down to come to battle, dies in some freak accident crossing a river. He actually, the troops are like crossing, and he gets trapped under the water, and nobody's able to get to him in time. And so the leader, the King of France, drowns on the way down, and so that doesn't help morale very well as they're on their way getting there. The troops now that don't have a king that they're following, and so this crusade ends up being a major failure. They're not able to overcome Saladin and the Muslims, and so Saladin takes over and keeps Jerusalem and all that surrounding area. Okay. So with that, I just want to review so we have it right in the view of Jerusalem. Remember, 70 A.D. we have the destruction of the temple by Titus and the Roman armies. Then a remnant of Jews are allowed to stay there, and then in the early 2nd century, 130s, they lose the city, and so then they're able to resettle in there again. It's kind of not a real formal thing, but they're able to go back and inhabit it until 637, 638, and that's the one we saw. The first time the Muslims come in and capture and take Jerusalem is 637, 638, right in that time frame. Then the Crusades happen, and now the Christians or the Jews reclaim it back from the Muslims in 1099, and now the Muslims retake it again in 1187.
Is
So,
there any
back and
side
forth.
note on what's going on with the major Jewish contingent?
Now?
No, during these
Oh.
times?
No.
They're scattered a bit. And they're still
100%, especially since, we know the church, in Rome and in Antioch and all over the place. And there was a church, we know in Jerusalem. So remember that it got dispersed. I don't remember if that was the beginning of this study. We talked about it, I think, perhaps in a little bit in Acts as well, that when when the church that was at Jerusalem before 70 A.D. and the destruction, the church got out of there because how the historical kind of legendary account goes is that through visions that the church received, they got out of Jerusalem before Titus and the armies came in. So the Jews and everyone were still there, but the church got out, and they went, in fact, into a land that was being controlled, remember, by, we talked about this in Acts, by one of the Herods, by King Herod Agrippa II, who actually was the one at the end of Acts that heard Paul speak and said, in such a short time, you convinced me to believe. And so under his jurisdiction, the church leaves Jerusalem, and they're allowed to safely stay under his jurisdiction. He was very friendly to the church and allowed them to come in. So the church at Jerusalem actually had moved before all that happened. But sure, there was a remnant of the church, but the Jews, like you say, would have been scattered through these battles and through these things. So was there a remnant? Sure, I believe there obviously was, of Jews, and then a remnant also of the church of believers as well. But I can't speak too intelligently about that. Yeah. Good. Other thoughts, questions? You see, again, this tug-of-war, back and forth thing. And again, we're still there now because, like it was said, and the Muslims have it, it's going to come up into modern day era for us that Israel finally gets to become a nation again. Remember, not even until 1948. So, and then they finally, 20 years later, 1967 is when they actually get Jerusalem back. Okay, so it's going to be just this constant back and forth, and we know currently, right now, as of today, the Muslims want all of Jerusalem, and they want to blow the Jews off the planet. So, it's not ending. And you see now how long it's been happening for them. Okay, so if we talk about that first time the Muslims took over, that's in 637. I mean, that's nearly, 15 centuries we're talking about that's been going on?
When did they build the Dome of the Rock? Anybody knows? Because the temple was already there. The temple was destroyed by Titus. After that, did they start building their own mosque there?
thousands?
I'm trying to.
Was I Googled up last time?
I just don't want to misspeak. Yeah, if you would, maybe you can find a reliable source. I don't want to
Thousands.
misspeak there. I don't.
Was it?
I can't recall of a date, but it was much later than that. It wasn't like Titus came in and destroyed it, and then the Muslims moved in. Remember, we didn't see this Muslim push and this Muslim expansion until the Middle Ages.
Right.
So their conquests and their conquerors are going to be done here with the fall of the East in like 1453. So in the 14th century. So it's not like they went in and built the Dome of the Rock as soon as the temple was destroyed.
Right.
This was later. It's a good question. Good question.
The late 7th century.
Yeah, so 600s, and that's what we're talking about when they took it over. They took over in 637, 638, and then shortly thereafter, that's when they set up their own stuff. So about 600 years later,
Okay.
after the destruction. Okay, Fourth Crusade. This is the last one that we'll kind of look into some details, and this one's interesting. 1202 to 1204. So now look, we're moving into, well into the late Middle Ages. We're coming to near the end of the thing, right? We're in 1200s. It's going to be the Middle Ages, say the 1500s. So we should be getting done and finishing, wrapping it up in about 300 years on our timeline. So this was really a low point of these Crusades. And this crusade was called by Pope Innocent III. We've talked about him a little bit. This was the same pope he's going to end up calling the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. So I bring that up now because we're obviously getting close to that time frame. And the Fourth Lateran Council is going to be significant in defining what we kind of know as the Roman Catholic Church now. And that's what that council is going to be doing, is kind of formulating a lot of those things that we know are already formulated at this point, right? We've seen the ball going. We've seen it all developing. And so he's going to call that, and coming up shortly. So it's the same guy who calls this Fourth Crusade. And here's the spiel. Remember our map, it's been a while, but you've got the Western Empire over here, Eastern Empire over here, and you've got kind of Israel, Jerusalem would be down here, and you've got all of Egypt that would be down here. So all the other attacks have been coming from the north down. So they've been attacking from the north, which makes sense, that's where they are. So they're coming across. Their strategy now changes and says, hey, let's go around, from the flank, and let's hit them from the south. The problem with that is that it's very expensive. Remember, obviously, the time that we're talking about is a lot different. So they need a lot of money to have ships and supplies and armies and all this stuff to make this long journey around the bottom and come up Egypt to hit them, to hit the Muslims from the south. So they don't have the money to be able to do what they want to do. So they figure, hey, how can we get the money to do what we want to do? So they're going to go and try to partner up again. So the Pope goes over and talks to the Emperor over in the East again and says, hey, let's join forces in this thing again and go get these guys again. So the Emperor at that time, Alexius the Fourth, says, okay, I'll help you guys do that if you help me solidify my place as Emperor in the East, because there was a lot of struggle going on for the Emperor in the East. So he says to the Crusaders, you guys come over and help me in Constantinople and set me up in power, and then I will pay you and give you the money to go do your crusade and do your war. So they say, okay, we'll do that. So they go with him. They solidify him there in Constantinople as the emperor in the East, and then he doesn't have the money to pay them. So he says to them, give me 6 months, I'll have the money for you. All this time, the Crusaders are hanging out in the East. The East doesn't like this. They don't like the Crusaders because they're from the West, and they don't like the West. They grow impatient with Alexius, and Alexius is murdered. So, yeah, now you see it coming, right? Like, how are you ever going to get your money now? So now the guy's dead, and the next emperor, who, and again, remember, this isn't like you see Alexius V, that's not his son. remember we talked about this, how emperors and popes actually assume and take names of people who they kind of view as their role models. So that's why you have Pope, John Paul the 18th, or you know what I mean, whatever. If you like missions, you're named after this guy. If you like killing and you're ruthless, you take this name. And so this one is murdered, and the next one takes his name, and is Alexius the Fifth. And so this new guy comes in and says, "Dude, we didn't have no deal. I'm not paying you any money. I don't care about what that guy said, and you're not going to get your money." So the Crusaders become angry, and they become violent, and they siege Constantinople, and it's pretty ugly from some of the details that you can read. And so now you've got the Christian Crusaders going and just killing people and rummaging and wrecking Constantinople and wrecking the empire and things in the east, because they made promises they weren't going to fulfill, and now they're warriors and they're fighters, and you don't treat us like this. So you see what a big black eye these Crusades are on the church, especially from the general public who doesn't understand the church as we're talking about the church isn't who was doing this. It was the Pope and the corrupt establishment that calls themselves the church.
Yeah.
And sure, were there believers peppered in there? I'm sure there were. Okay, but the intentions that we see and everything that they're doing point to us to tell you this wasn't a Christian engagement. Okay, so this is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So this is the end of like the East-West thing. Like yeah, let's go together and do these things. Like we're done with you guys. Obviously, you can see that would be the fallout for them. Okay. So to kind of sum up the Crusades, holy wars justified, they think, by battling back against the Muslims who have come and forcefully taken over their land. They also, remember, the big view is they justify it by saying, that's even, again, where the word Crusades comes from. It means to fight for the cross. The cause of the cross is what their whole thing was. That they were fighting to, preserve Christ's honor. They were fighting for the honor of Jesus Christ and sticking up for him against Muslims who were smearing, his name and sticking up for their own Muhammad and their own prophets and gods. Okay, so 1095 they start. The West comes to defend the East against the Muslims, and now this is the irony. Look at this. Some 100 years later now, when it's going to be over, the West, remember, initially came to help the East fight against the Muslims. Now, they're the ones destroying the East. You see it? So it leads, in fact, to Islam defeating them because they're so weak. See it? They're so vulnerable that Islam comes in and just defeats them and takes them over. So it's, in fact, the exact opposite of the intention that happened is what actually happened. The West and the East combine, say, hey, let's join forces and go do this. But then the West ends up killing the East and wrecking them and just defeating them and leaving them so wounded that the Muslims just come in and clean up the scraps and they take over. And essentially now we're coming to the fall in the East and the end of the Middle Ages. And that's where we're kind of heading down.
The whole thing's so weird though, because the Muslims and the Christians aren't really a race. They're just random people from all over the world who are sort of all mishmashed together, fighting for money.
Sure.
It's kind of crazy, really, the whole...
It is crazy.
It is kind of crazy. Yeah.
It's the same now. We're doing the
Sure.
same thing now.
Yeah.
Well, you got to remember depravity of man. We're wicked, we're evil, we are. That's what we do. Until God intervenes and steps in and changes your heart, and you are saved by the gospel of Jesus Christ, and you're being changed to be conformed more like Him. I want to be God. I want to be about me. I don't care about you. I'll steal your stuff. I'll do. I'll do whatever I do, whatever I want to do. Until that intent changes, which we can't do on our own. That's what's going to happen. Yep, exactly right. Good. So, in the Middle Ages, we discussed a few things. We've seen the Bishop of Rome or the Pope assuming that power in the West and becoming the authority. We've seen also the corruption that started to follow that pretty immediately, with the Pope having supreme authority over the West. Papal authority is going to be challenged, as I was speaking a little bit earlier. It's going to be challenged now with kind of the development and the rise of nationality, because now we have all these other countries, Switzerland, Germany, France, England, all the European nations that we think of today are all there now, and all the kings and emperors and leaders of those countries have no tie-in with the Pope, and they definitely don't view the Pope as their head.
Right.
Yeah.
They did for a long time, because the Pope
Sure.
run everything. It was
Yep.
from Henry VIII in England when that changed.
Right. That's right. But that's the shift. That's what's happening. Is it's going to stop now, because they are not going to just as the East wasn't going to bow to the Pope in the West. All these new countries and leaders of those countries in the East are not going to, or excuse me, in the West are not going to bow to the Pope anymore either. Okay. So they're going to start challenging that authority, and the Pope's going to start to kind of lose the grips of supremacy that he had once. We obviously know he still has much power and authority, but it's not the supreme authority that he had before, okay, over all of the West. Good. Okay. And again, we're going to see major problems with apostolic succession, which we've talked about so many times now, with the problems in that. That thought of going back to Peter, and Peter passing essentially the baton, handing the keys to the next pope, and we saw how the popes were killing each other, and there's going to be, this is the last that I have in PowerPoint for tonight, so I guess we're going to wrap up early and have a lot of discussion time. But next week we're going to start looking into, there's what's called the papal schism, and that's going to get real interesting, because now not only do we see the problem with these popes being cut off and killing each other, and who's the true pope, and all these things, but there's now going to become multiple popes, and it's just going to get chaotic. There's going to be multiple popes, and I'm the true pope, and you're the true pope. There's going to be councils that come and say, neither of you are the pope, and we're going to elect a third guy the pope, and now there's 3 popes, and then they're going to say nobody's the pope and rename another pope. It's impossible for them to apologetically stand on the thought of papal apostolic succession, of God's representative from Peter to one man to one man to one man. We've already seen a couple of the problems in this papal schism. You're going to see just more huge problems. It's ridiculous, is really what it is. So good. So I know I've hit you with a lot of stuff. And Rick, man, I apologize. You've come in on I don't apologize, because I'm glad you're here. But you've come in on a church history study in a week where we're so entrenched in a lot of stuff. And so maybe we can talk a little bit more.
It's all good. I'll catch up later, but
Yep.
it's just nice to get out and hang out with you guys.
Amen.
Anyway, so.
And that's I appreciate you being here. And yeah, man, we can definitely talk a little bit more after. But I'm glad you're here. But guys, for you guys who have been here, even that was could be again like a drinking water from a fire hydrant kind of thing. And I know I talk fast. I give a lot of information, so I've been told. But yeah, thoughts, questions, because some of the stuff, we hear about, and we have heard about, and we have thoughts about, and we at the very get-go, first week 1 of this study, I kind of laid that out and said, hey, here's a reason why we need to really study these things, because most of the people in the church today are ignorant of even the Bible, but they're definitely ignorant of any kind of church history stuff. You maybe know the name Martin Luther. You maybe know he nailed something to a door in some country a long time ago, and boom, that's the Reformation. And that's pretty much what a informed church member today would know. But to know, what about the 1400, 1500 years before the Reformation? What happened in there? And obviously, we're unpacking a good deal of that. So, you hear things and it's like, well, it was all the Catholic Church, and then all of a sudden there was the Reformation. So you see now that's not, in fact, accurate. We're just doing a survey, and hopefully we've learned and caught a lot of information that we can understand a little more depth. But Manny, I saw you had a thought, a
No,
question.
but my thought last night when I was reading so much about it was that you see all these different groups of Muslims that have been fighting all these wars against us, since the time of Saddam Hussein and so on, how brave they are defending their land.
Mm.
And it came to me in which I said, it goes back all the way to the Crusades. And even now,
Ishmael, not Isaac.
That's exactly right. Right. So back even farther. But the cool thing is that now we connect the dots.
We
We
connect
start
the
to.
dots.
So even if we're only understanding, a minimal amount of the notes you're writing, and obviously you can keep studying like you are and reading on your own, studying your notes. Keep asking each other questions. It is helpful because you start to piece together history, and obviously the application is what we want to be looking for as well. That things we can learn from mistakes that that they made in the past, and men that we hold in high regard and in high esteem, and we should, and then other men that we shouldn't, and be aware of false teachers, just as Paul tells many times, and we see it all through church history we've looked at already. You just see so many things, but yeah, that's right. To be able to plug those things in and to understand, well, that's right. Before Hussein, before all that, before all the stuff we see happening now, like he said, God told us that was going to happen all the way back to the beginning with the boys, okay? But we can see it unfold and see it unpacking, and we know it's going to continue until Christ comes back. But to know a little bit of that and see why, and to see now the struggle over Jerusalem and the struggle and why the Muslims so much hate us even now. Because, like I said, they still feel these crusades and these holy wars, like that struggle and that battle is not going to end. Which is why they hate the United States, because we're a Christian nation. Well, look at what happened and what they claim was the Christian nation for a couple hundred years there in the Crusades, and what was what they were dealing with. So yeah, it definitely gives good insight.
and the great thing is, you can offer the Palestinians anything in the world. Anything. A land, a port, whatever you can offer them. And the answer will always be no, because Jerusalem is their capital.
Right.
It's their capital.
Yep.
And that's how you tie all the knots.
Yep.
That's
Good.
how you tie all the knots.
Yeah, and it was important for us to see, even when we talk about that, as we hear all the time, and maybe you don't, but I mean, in circles and classes and discussions, you'll hear about, Roman Catholics have the history on their side, and they've rewritten history, is what hopefully you're seeing a lot more now through the last couple months, because the history that they teach and that they will preach to their people, and their people that won't study. I mean, their people don't study their church and their Bible just as much as our church doesn't. So it's not like they're common people of them. They know any of this. So you can go back and, like you said, even see the history of Islam. And saying, well, Jerusalem was always ours. And it's like, well, in fact, no, it wasn't until the 7th century.
Right.
Not till the 7th century when you went in and took it by force was it yours, And when the mosques were built, when the domes of the rock came in, and the temples that were there well before that. In fact, 2 Jewish temples were there before that. Okay.
Islam wasn't created when the Philistines,
Right. So that's exactly right. But that's why, again, remember what we always talk about several times, I should say, we've talked about the gaining credibility. So when you go back to even like Muhammad and, the Quran and the teachings and the things that they claim and that they hold to, divine revelation. Because remember, that's how it always starts. They have to have, I had revelation from God, and his epilepsies were dreams and revelations that angels were telling him these things. And remember how he related it back again to Ishmael and back to Abraham and back to Allah being the God of Israel and the God of the Old Testament of the Bible. So they try to interweave it all into Scripture because they want to gain credibility for validity of historical accounts. See what I mean? And that's what they all do. That's what the Jehovah's Witness, the Watchtower, that's what Joseph Smith and Charles Russell, that's what every one of them do. They have to try to get credibility. And where does that generally come from? The Scriptures. And we know that Satan works great at that. You know, just little nugget of truth, and then you can put a bunch of junk all around it. But as long as you hook them with something that is true, that they can grab a hold of, then we can convince them all the other stuff's true. See it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's a big ball of rat poison, and we'll just put a little cheese in the middle. You know what I mean? Like, it's effective. It's effective. So, good. Yeah, good. Any other thoughts, comments?
Thing goes back to Ishmael. Right?
Goes back
To
to
Abraham.
Look at this old man.
I was told by a Muslim, how can you go against us when God blessed Israel
Yeah,
and told him he will be a great nation?
right.
He also said be a wild donkey of a man and everybody would
But
hate
it
him.
makes that
King
just
James.
said,
King James language is better, but
you can make it wherever you want to make it.
Right.
How can you say that when he was blessed by God
Bastard
and his
child.
mother? Same father. And you can go and they can talk to you and you go,
yeah,
So think about that. That's how they attack you with that.
sure. Well, then we know
But if that-
obviously we can go to Romans, we can go to Galatians, we go to get several places to show that the promise was
The son of the promise.
was through the seed, not from Hagar. It was from the seed of Abraham. and through his
The
wife, through
promise.
Sarah, was the promise that Hagar was the slave woman and we are not slave. Paul says that we are of the free woman, not of the bondservant. And the promise came through the seed that was promised to Abraham, which was Isaac. And that's why they can't use real scriptures to back up their side, because the scriptures say it wasn't through Ishmael. And yes, you're right, he promised Hagar that her and her son wouldn't die out in the heat of the sun that day. But he said, he will be a father of many nations and 12 sons, and just like Abraham, and the 12 tribes and all that. But like you said, he will be an ass of a man, and everyone will be against him. And, that's the war that we know was
That's the war we have.
foreseen and foretold of to happen.
Jesus Christ.
But yeah, make no mistakes. The
Well,
scriptures tell us we are on the right side.
I have always
Yeah.
heard too when I had the discussion was that
I'm gonna
Jesus is a
stop
great
there.
prophet